They say a man like Cade Marlowe doesn't feel anything anymore. They said the same thing about the storm that swallowed the Ashbone Mountains whole that October night. But storms end, and some things, some broken, impossible, devastating things, take root in the wreckage and refuse to die. He was supposed to deliver one fugitive, collect his money, and ride south before the first snow sealed the passes. Instead, he found a child standing in the middle of a drowning road barefoot, holding a key that 3 men had already died for, and the most powerful man in the territory was willing to kill 100 more to get back. What he did next destroyed everything he thought he was. What she showed him destroyed everything he thought he knew. The rain came sideways. It had been coming sideways for 3 hours. By the time Cade Marlowe reached the bend in the Kettrick Road, where the pines grew so thick, they leaned over the path, like old men whispering secrets to the mud. His horse, a roan mare named Duchess, who had survived more bad decisions than most men twice her age, tossed her head and blew hard through her nose, which was the equine equivalent of saying, "I told you so." "I know," Cade said. He'd known before he left Harlow Station that the weather was turning. The innkeeper had told him. The stableman had told him. Even the drunk sleeping under the hitching post had rolled over, opened one roomy eye, and said something that sounded like "Passel close, brother." Cade had paid his tab, collected his saddlebags, and ridden north anyway, because Elias Pruitt was worth $42 dead or alive, and Elias Pruitt had last been spotted in the logging camp at Cutter's Ridge, and $42 was $42. That was the arithmetic of Cade Marlowe's life. Clean, cold, and unambiguous. He was 34 years old, and had been a bounty hunter for 11 years. Before that, he'd been a deputy in Calhoun County, which had ended badly. Before that, a soldier, which had ended worse. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw that he'd stopped explaining to people because the truth was complicated and lies required energy he didn't have. He owned 1 horse, 2 pistols, a rifle he'd taken off a man who no longer needed it in Breckenridge, a bedroll, a faded photograph he never looked at, and a reputation that was either fearsome or pitiful depending on who you asked. He did not own a home, a wife, a dog, a friend, or any illusions about the nature of men. This was, he had decided long ago, a perfectly functional way to exist. The road dipped into a shallow gulch where a creek was already threatening its banks, brown water churning with pine needles and broken branches, and Duchess picked her way across the submerged stones with the careful dignity of an animal who had accepted danger as a permanent condition of employment. The smell hit him before they'd cleared the water. Wet pine and creek silt, and something else beneath it, something sharp and electric. The smell of a storm that wasn't finished with you yet. Lightning walked the peaks to the north, illuminating the Ashbone Range in stuttering white, those ancient, serrated ridgelines that the Kettrick locals called the Teeth, and not affectionately. Cutter's Ridge sat on the other side of those teeth. There were 2 ways through. The low road, which ran along the river valley and took 3 days, was impassable in October rain. The Mara River flooded its banks reliably every autumn, and the road became a brown lake that swallowed wagon axles whole. The high road, the Ashbone Pass, was navigable until the first serious snow. 2 days through, if you pushed. 1.5 if you were reckless, and your horse was good. Cade was reckless. Duchess was good. He was calculating the odds, as he did everything, when Duchess stopped. Not the nervous, sideways stop of a spooked animal. The solid, planted, 4 legs lock stop of a horse that has seen something it intends to take seriously. Her ears went forward. Her nostrils flared. Cade's hand moved to his pistol before his mind caught up. He saw her a moment later. She was standing in the center of the road, which had gone to black mud in the rain, mud that sucked at every footfall and held it. She was small, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, though she was thin enough that it was hard to judge, and she was wearing a dress that had once been blue and was now the color of nothing, soaked through and plastered to her skin. Her feet were bare, not bootless, bare, with no stockings, the mud coming up between her toes. Her dark hair hung in ropes across her face. She was not crying. She was not calling out. She was simply standing there, in the rain, in the middle of the road, the way a fence post stands, as if she had been put there and had no particular opinion about it. Cade stared at her for a long moment. Duchess took one step forward, then stopped again, waiting for direction. "Hey," Cade said. The girl didn't move. "Hey!" Louder this time. He pulled back his hood, so she could see his face, which he immediately regretted because the rain hit him full across the eyes. "Girl, you lost." Stupid question. Obviously she was lost. Or something worse than lost. He looked up and down the road. Nothing. The pines on either side were dark walls, their branches hissing under the weight of water. No wagon. No horse. No farmstead within 3 miles in any direction that he knew of. And he'd ridden this road before, 2 winters back, chasing a forger named Beaumont Sill. There was nothing out here. There was nothing out here, even in good weather. He looked back at the girl. She had turned her face up toward him, and he could see her eyes now. Dark eyes, wide and still, with the particular stillness that he recognized from war, from men who had seen too much in too short a time, and whose minds had gone somewhere quieter to wait it out. He looked at the road ahead. Cutter's Ridge. $42. The arithmetic of his life. He looked at the girl. "Damn it," he said. He swung down from Duchess, with the kind of reluctance a man usually reserves for stepping into courtrooms or confessionals. The mud took his boots to the ankle immediately, a cold, sucking grip, and he waded toward her, and she didn't back away, didn't run, didn't do anything at all. Up close she was worse. There were bruises along her left forearm, yellowing at the edges, a few days old, a cut above her right eyebrow, nearly healed. She was shaking, but the slow, rhythmic shaking of a body that had been cold for a long time and was beginning to forget what warm felt like. He crouched to her level. She looked at him directly, which surprised him. Most children, in his experience, looked away from him. Something about his face or his manner communicated this person is not safe, and they were generally correct. She did not look away. "You speak," he said. She said nothing. "You have people nearby?" "Family." Nothing. But her right hand moved. Not toward him, just a slight, reflexive movement, pressing something against her sternum through the wet fabric of her dress. A shape there. Something hanging around her neck. "All right," he said, because there was nothing else to say. He shrugged off his riding coat, oilskin over wool, the only thing keeping him from the same condition she was in, and wrapped it around her. It swallowed her whole. She disappeared inside it like a child in a tent. He picked her up. She weighed almost nothing. That bothered him more than anything else so far. He settled her in front of him in the saddle, wrapping one arm around to hold her, and pulled what remained of his coat across them both. And Duchess, without being told, turned off the main road and into the tree line, because Duchess had opinions about shelter, and this particular grove had a slight overhang where 2 boulders had fallen together. They weren't dry, but they were less wet. Cade built a fire in the hollow between the rocks, a small one, sheltered from the wind, and worked with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had made emergency camps in bad conditions more times than he'd had hot meals. Tinder from his oilskin pouch. Flint. 2 strikes. A coal, then a flame, then something real. The girl sat close to it without being asked. She held her hands toward the heat and watched the fire the way she'd watched him. Steady, assessing, private. He heated water in his tin cup and made something that approximated tea from a sachet of dried herbs he carried in his kit. He gave her jerked venison and hard biscuit from his pack. She ate both with focused intensity. No manners, both hands, like an animal that has learned not to trust that the food will still be there in 10 seconds. He watched her and said nothing, because he knew that look too. When she'd eaten, she put her hands back in her lap and looked at the fire. The key was visible now. The coat had fallen open slightly, and the thing around her neck had come loose from beneath her dress, a cord of braided leather, and on it an iron key. Not a door key. Smaller. A box key. The kind of thing that opened a strongbox or a dispatch case. Blackened iron, old, with a distinctive double-tooth cut, and a small mark on the bow, a stamped symbol he couldn't make out in the firelight. "What's that?" he said. She looked down at the key, then back at him. "Someone give you that?" She pulled it back under the coat without expression. Cade leaned back against the rock and pulled his hat down over his eyes. The rain hammered the canopy above. Somewhere in the trees, something moved, a branch, a night bird, the weight of water redistributing itself. He listened to it and thought about Elias Pruitt and $42 and the Ashbone Pass. And then he thought about the girl's eyes and the bruises on her arm and the way she'd been standing in the road like someone had set her down and driven away. He didn't sleep. He never slept well, and tonight was worse than most. An hour before dawn, the rain eased. He found out her name the next morning, though found out is generous. It was more that he figured it out the way you figure out a puzzle, when someone takes all the pieces away, but leaves you one corner. She had a pocket in her dress. He discovered this because she spent 20 minutes after breakfast pulling things from it and arranging them on the flat surface of a rock. A folded piece of paper, crinkled and damp at the edges. A small carved wooden horse, no bigger than his thumb. A dried flower, some mountain variety, purple, pressed flat as a leaf. And a button, bone white, that she held separately from the others, in her fist. He watched her arrange these items, with the solemn attention of a priest setting an altar. He reached over slowly, no sudden movements, and tapped the paper. She looked at him, then nodded once, which was the most communication she'd offered so far. He unfolded it. A letter, or the end of a letter. The first page was gone. The remaining half was a father's handwriting, the kind that started careful and grew urgent as it went. You must not let anyone see it. Not Marshal Hale, especially not him. The box is in the surveyor's office at Cutter's Ridge, behind the northern wall panel, third board from the left. The key is the only one. I had the locksmith destroy the mold. What's inside will end him and everyone who works for him, but only if it reaches Judge Carmichael in Telford. That's 30 miles past the pass. Ellie, my girl, if you're reading this without me. The letter ended there. Torn, or burned. The edge was irregular, and there was a brown stain in the corner that Cade recognized. He refolded it carefully. Ellie. He looked at her. She was watching him with those dark, still eyes. Ellie, he said. Something moved across her face. Not a flinch. Not a smile. Something between the two. A small internal earthquake that she suppressed immediately. The way you press your thumb against a bruise to confirm it still hurts. So, Ellie, I'm Cade, he said. I hunt people for money. I'm going to be honest with you about that from the start. She looked at him. Your father, the man who wrote this letter. Where is he? She looked at the fire. He understood. He sat back and thought for a while. The mountains to the north were visible now that the rain had eased, the Ashbone peaks draped in fresh cloud. Their upper reaches, white with early snow. The pass was up there. He couldn't see it from here, but he knew where it was, a notch in the ridgeline shaped like a broken tooth that the locals called Widow's Notch for reasons that were depressingly obvious. The surveyor's office at Cutter's Ridge. A strongbox. A letter that Marshal Hale couldn't know about. He'd heard of Denton Hale. Every man working the territories had heard of Denton Hale. Officially, Hale was the territorial marshal, appointed by the governor, empowered to maintain order in the three-county region that everyone called the Ashbone Territory because the mountains divided it from the settled east as cleanly as a blade. Unofficially, Hale was the most feared man between the Mara River and the Continental Divide, and not because he was particularly good at his job. There were stories about land grants disappearing from the registry, about homesteaders who'd settled the northern valleys and then been run off, or not run off, so much as simply ceased to exist, about the governor's surveying operations, which seemed to locate mineral deposits with supernatural accuracy right before private purchase agreements materialized for those same parcels, about the men who'd asked too many questions, a circuit judge named Pollard, a land agent named Drusk, who had died in ways the official record called accidents. If Ellie's father had been a surveyor, your father worked for the territory, he said. She looked at him. Then, very deliberately, she made a small gesture with her hand, a motion he didn't understand at first, and then did. She was turning something, like turning a key. Then she pointed at the real key around her neck, and then she pointed north. He nodded slowly. The box is at Cutter's Ridge, he said, and you need to get what's inside to a judge in Telford. She kept her eyes on him, steady, waiting. That's 30 miles on the far side of the pass, he said, in October, with people looking for that key. She didn't blink. He thought about $42. He thought about Elias Pruitt, who was probably drunk in a logging bunk right now and would be just as catchable in the spring. He thought about the fact that he hadn't done anything purely for free since 1887, and that this was 1893, and he was not a good man, and good men got buried in the mountains all the time for getting involved in things that were above them. He also thought about the bruises on her arm. He thought about the brown stain on the edge of the letter. He thought about the way she'd been standing in the road, alone, in the dark, in the rain, as if she'd simply run until she couldn't run anymore, and then stood still and waited to see what happened next. "Get your things," he said. They made Kettrick Crossing by mid-morning, a nothing settlement, 3 buildings and a livery, and a general store that doubled as the post office, half the town perpetually drunk, and the other half perpetually suspicious of the drunk half. Cade stopped only long enough to buy supplies: dried beans, hard cheese, more jerky, oilskin matches, a pair of child's boots that were slightly too large, but which Ellie laced tight and wore with the focused satisfaction of someone who'd been given back something they hadn't realized they'd lost. The storekeeper, a bony woman named Pratt who had been minding her own business successfully for 40 years and saw no reason to stop now, looked at Ellie and then at Cade and said nothing, which Cade appreciated. He was loading Duchess at the livery rail when he saw the riders, 2 of them, coming in from the south on the Kettrick Road. They were moving at the kind of pace that isn't galloping, but isn't relaxed either. The pace of men who are following something, but trying not to look like they are. Their horses were good. Not logging camp horses or farmer horses. Long-legged trail horses, dark and well-fed, with the kind of tack that costs more than most men in this settlement made in a season. One of the men was broad across the shoulders, with a coat the color of dried blood. The other was lean, with a pale face under a flat-brimmed hat that he wore pulled low. Cade watched them from under the livery roof, one hand resting on Duchess's neck, not moving. They stopped at the store. The broad one went inside. The lean one stayed with the horses, and his eyes moved over the settlement with the methodical patience of a man conducting a search. His gaze passed over the livery, over Cade, over Duchess, and moved on, and then came back. Cade was already pulling Duchess's reins. He found Ellie in the livery, sitting on a bale of hay, drawing in the dust with her finger. He didn't say anything. He just touched her shoulder, and she looked up at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her stand up immediately. They went out the back of the livery, through a gap in the fence, and into the tree line behind the settlement, and Cade moved Duchess at a walk, because a trot makes noise, and at this point noise was the enemy. The sound of hooves in soft mud, a sucking, rhythmic pull, 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 seemed impossibly loud to him, but the trees closed around them and the settlement disappeared behind a curtain of pine. He circled north and west, the long way, adding an hour to their approach to the pass. He didn't hear pursuit. He didn't stop listening for it. Part 4. The smell of what's coming. The Ashbone Pass began where the pines gave out. There was a distinct line, the kind that looked drawn below it. The dense lodgepole forest that covered the mountain skirts, fragrant and dark, the air beneath it perpetually damp and mushroom-scented, the forest floor a rust-colored mat of dropped needles that muffled every sound. Above it, the tree line ended in a ragged fringe, and then nothing. Open slope, scree and windswept grass, and exposed rock. And then the pass itself, a narrow corridor between 2 cliff faces that funneled the wind until it came through screaming. They reached the tree line at early afternoon. Cade stopped Duchess and studied the slope above. The sky had gone from gray to a darker gray with the particular bruised quality that meant snow was somewhere in the conversation. The wind was picking up, coming off the peaks in long, cold gusts that smelled of ice and altitude. The pass was visible, the notch in the ridgeline, maybe 1,000 feet of elevation gained from where they stood, and then the descent into the Cutter's Ridge drainage on the other side. Ellie was sitting in front of him in the saddle, as she had been all morning. She'd said nothing. She hadn't said anything at all, not a word, and he gradually understood that this wasn't trauma-induced muteness, at least not entirely. She was simply watching, absorbing. She had the kind of attention that children rarely have, and adults almost never develop, the kind that doesn't demand to be acknowledged. She was looking at the slope now the same way he was. 2 hours up, he said, more to himself than to her. 2 hours down the other side. Maybe 3 if the footing's bad. We'll be in Cutter's Ridge by dark. She looked at him. The office first, he said. Then we ride straight through. We can sleep on the Telford side. She touched the key at her throat. Yeah, he said. Almost there. He nudged Duchess forward, and they began to climb. The first quarter-mile was manageable. A logging trail wound up through the last of the trees, and Duchess took it with her usual phlegmatic competence, picking her footing without drama. The smell of the pines was intensely present here, wet from last night's rain, that sharp green resin smell that cut right through to something animal at the back of your brain. Every branch they brushed released a small shower of cold drops. The mud under Duchess's hooves changed texture as they climbed, less silt, more clay, then rocky clay, each step leaving a clean impression that filled slowly with water. Cade kept looking back, not nervously. He was constitutionally incapable of nervous, but consistently, the way a compass returns to north, every few minutes, a full rotation of the saddle, scanning the slope below and the tree line they'd come through. Nothing, which meant less than nothing in his experience. The men who were good at following you were the ones you didn't see until they wanted you to. Ellie had noticed him looking. She had started doing it too, this small girl, copying his scan of the terrain below with the same systematic sweep, left to right, tree line to slope, slope to sky. He would have found it almost funny if the situation had any room for funny. You don't have to watch, he said. She gave him a look that communicated, quite clearly, that she would continue to watch. All right, he said. They cleared the trees. The wind hit them immediately, a physical thing, and Duchess leaned into it with her ears laid back. Ellie tucked into Cade's chest without being asked, and he pulled the coat tighter around them both. The slope above was bare grass and loose stone. The grass bent horizontal by the wind, the stones ranging from ankle-turning pebbles to boulders the size of carriages, some of them streaked with the orange of iron oxide, some gray-white, all of them glistening with moisture. The smell changed entirely up here. The pine was gone, replaced by cold mineral air, the smell of stone and elevation and the particular cleanness that lives above the tree line, a smell so pure it was almost aggressive. Rain-washed granite, ice on the way. Duchess moved at a steady walk. Cade let her pick her pace. He was watching the ridgeline ahead, the way the cliff faces narrowed toward the pass, when he heard it. A sound below them, the sound of a dislodged stone bouncing. He turned. The tree line was 200 feet below. The slope was empty, gray-green grass, dark stone, the fringe of pines. Nothing moving. But the stone had moved. Something had moved it. He didn't say anything. He reached forward and covered Ellie's hand with his, and she went still, which told him she'd heard it too. He waited 30 seconds. 60. The wind filled the silence, moaning through the cliff faces above. Nothing else. Move, he said quietly, and Duchess moved. Part 5. The Pass. The widow's notch was worse than he remembered. It was always worse than you remembered, because the memory edited out the misery and kept the landmark quality. The dramatic narrowing, the walls of pale rock rising on either side, the sense of being funneled through something that the mountains had tolerated rather than welcomed. But the memory never kept the wind, which in the notch was not just strong but structural, a force that seemed to push from multiple directions simultaneously, the cliff faces creating vectors that contradicted each other and resulted in a chaos of air that made Duchess sidle and shake her head with active resentment. And it never kept the sound of it. The widow's notch screamed. Not metaphorically. The wind coming through the gap in the rock produced a high, sustained wail that oscillated with the gusts, rising and falling in a register that was almost human. The first time Cade had ridden through it, years ago, younger, cockier, on a horse he no longer had, he'd had to fight the urge to answer it. Ellie pressed against him and made no sound. The footing in the pass was the worst of it. A thin path, barely 3 feet wide, wound through the notch on a slight upward grade, and the surface was a combination of loose shale and compacted gravel that had been polished by 1,000 years of wind and weather to something approaching the friction coefficient of soap. Duchess moved with excruciating care, each hoof placed with the calculation of a chess master, and even so she slipped twice, not badly, catching herself each time with a grunt of effort, but enough to remind Cade that this animal was carrying 2 people and that the drop on the left side of the path was not forgiving. He didn't look at the drop. He focused on the path ahead, on Duchess's ears, on the next 10 feet of rock. The pass was maybe a quarter-mile through. It felt longer. On the far side, the cliff faces opened suddenly, extravagantly, like a door thrown wide, and the descent into the Cutter's Ridge drainage spread out below them in a relief of brown grass and dark timber, and, far below, the glint of the Mara tributary that ran through the valley. The wind dropped by half the moment they cleared the notch. Duchess exhaled with what Cade could only interpret as profound vindication. He turned to look back through the pass. For a moment, the far end of the notch, the slope they'd climbed, the tree line below it, was visible as a bright rectangle framed by rock. A silhouette, just for a moment, at the entrance to the pass. A rider, sitting still. Then the wind shifted and the frame went gray, and the silhouette was gone. He turned back to the descent. "All right," he said softly. "We move fast now." Part 6. Cutter's Ridge. Cutter's Ridge was a mining town wearing a logging town's clothes, or maybe the reverse. It had been a silver camp first, then the silver had thinned out, and the timber had come, and now it was that particular flavor of frontier settlement that exists in the uncomfortable space between boom and bust, still using the infrastructure of ambition, but beginning to see through it. Main Street was unpaved and deep in mud from the overnight rain. The buildings along it were the usual mix. 2 saloons, a general store, a barber, a land office that also served as the assay office, a hotel with a porch that was actively losing its structural argument with gravity, and at the north end of the street, set slightly apart from the others on a corner lot, a modest frame building with a painted sign, Territorial Survey Office, T.A. Mason, Surveyor. T.A. Mason, Ellie's father. The lights in the survey office were dark. Cade had expected that, but it still landed somewhere in his chest in a way he chose not to examine. He hitched Duchess at the rail 2 buildings down, in front of the feed store, which was closed, which meant fewer eyes. He lifted Ellie down, and they walked along the boardwalk in the early dusk, past a man sleeping in a chair outside the barber's, past a boy with a lantern heading somewhere with the urgency of someone who's been told twice to be home by now. The survey office door was locked. This was not a problem. Cade could pick locks. This was one of several skills he'd acquired over the years that he preferred not to list in polite company. 45 seconds. Inside, the office was dark and had the particular smell of a place that has been closed for several days. Old paper, lamp oil that had burned down and gone cold, and something sweet-rotten beneath it that Cade identified as a half-eaten piece of fruit on the desk, a plum or a pear, now dark and collapsed. He didn't light a lamp. He let his eyes adjust and let Ellie's hand tug him toward the north wall. She knew exactly where. 3rd board from the left. She'd read it in the letter too. Had probably read it 100 times. She crouched and ran her fingers along the baseboard until she found it. A board that was fractionally proud of its neighbors. The nails at top and bottom, slightly off the vertical. She looked up at him. He worked the blade of his knife along the edge until the board came loose, pivoting on a central nail, revealing a cavity behind the plaster. The box was there. Iron, about the size of a hat box, with a hasp and a lock. Old but solid. The kind of thing made to be found in 100 years and still be intact. Ellie had the key off her neck before he could reach for it. She fitted it to the lock. Her hands were steady. He noted, steadier than his would have been, and turned it. The lock opened with a sound like a held breath releasing. He lifted the lid. Papers. A stack of them, folded, sealed, indexed with a surveyor's precision. Each document dated, signed, cross-referenced. He lifted the top layer and tilted it toward the faint light from the street. He read for 2 minutes. Then he sat back on his heels. Jesus, he thought. He'd expected something damning. He'd been around long enough to know that men like Hale didn't get where they were by being careless with their crimes. There was always paperwork, because paperwork was how you controlled things, how you made arrangements look like procedures. He'd expected forged land grants, maybe, backdated purchase agreements, the ordinary machinery of corruption. This was not ordinary. This was survey reports, official, stamped, bearing the territorial governor's seal, that had been falsified to exclude mineral deposits from the public land assessment, deposits worth millions, and alongside them, the originals, the real surveys signed by T.A. Mason and countersigned by 2 other surveyors, whose names Cade didn't recognize, but whose signatures appeared on death certificates at the bottom of the box. 2 men, both died in mining accidents in the past year, both ruled accidental by the territorial marshal's office. And at the very bottom a ledger, small, leather-bound, written in a hand Cade didn't recognize. Names, dates, amounts, the kind of ledger that was its own argument, the kind that a judge would understand immediately and a jury would understand 5 minutes later. The territorial governor, the marshal, 3 land agents, a federal surveyor, the whole architecture of it, laid out in ink. Your father, he said quietly, was a very brave man. He looked at Ellie. She was looking at the papers with an expression that had finally cracked open slightly, not crying, but close, the way a sky looks right before rain, the pressure behind it visible. He refolded the papers, replaced the ledger, closed the box, locked it, and put it in his saddlebag with the efficient care of a man who understands that what he's carrying has just changed the nature of his situation entirely. We need to go, he said. They went. Part 7, What the Dark Carries. They were 2 blocks from the survey office when the broad-shouldered man stepped out of the alley between the saloon and the hardware store. He was close, 20 feet. He had a pistol already drawn, which told Cade that he was experienced enough not to give a man like Cade the chance to make it a fair fight. Box, the man said. And the girl, his companion, the lean, pale-faced one, materialized from the other direction, the other jaw of a trap that had been waiting since Kettrick Crossing. Cade stood with Ellie slightly behind him. He didn't reach for his gun. That was, in this configuration, the correct decision. The box is in my saddlebag, Cade said, hitched at the feed store. Then we'll go get it together, the broad man said, nice and slow. Sure, Cade said. He had been in worse situations. Not many, but some. The thing about being in worse situations was that they calibrated you. They taught you to look for the specific geometry of an opening, the half-second window that exists in every bad moment if you've trained yourself to watch for it. The window came from an unexpected direction. The boy with the lantern, the one he'd seen earlier, hurrying home, appeared at the far end of the block, running now, really running, and he ran directly into the lean man's horse, which had been standing at the boardwalk rail, and the horse shied hard, and the lean man spun instinctively toward the sound. Half a second. Cade moved. He'd have been the first to tell you that what followed was not elegant. It was fast and close and conducted a volume that woke every dog in Cutter's Ridge, and it ended with the broad man down in the mud with a dislocated shoulder and the lean man's pistol in Cade's hand, and the lean man himself wedged against the hardware store wall with Cade's forearm across his throat. Who sent you? Cade said. The lean man said nothing. Cade pressed harder. Hale, the lean man said. He know about the box? A pause. Then, he knows there's something. The surveyor talked before. He stopped himself. Before, Cade said. Silence. Cade stepped back. He looked at the lean man for a moment, then at the broad man sitting up in the mud, cradling his arm, then at Ellie, who had watched all of this from the boardwalk with the same still attention she brought to everything. You tell Hale you found the girl, Cade said to the lean man. You tell him she didn't have anything. The key was to a room at the hotel. Nothing there. You lost her in the mountains. He won't believe that. Probably not. But it'll take him time to disbelieve it, and time is what I need. He held out the lean man's pistol, grip first. Take your friend. Get your horses. Ride south. The lean man stared at him. Now, Cade said, with a quality of voice that had been refined by 11 years of catching people who very much did not want to be caught. They went. He stood in the mud street of Cutter's Ridge, with Ellie beside him and the saddlebag over his shoulder, and listened to the hoofbeats diminish southward. Then he looked north, toward the road to Telford, and did the arithmetic one more time. 30 miles. A night ride. A dangerous road. He looked at Ellie. She was already looking at the north road. Yeah, he said. Let's go. Part 8. The night road. They rode through the dark. There was no moon. The clouds from last night's storm had thinned but not dispersed, and the sky was a milky darkness with no stars and only the faintest luminescence from somewhere above the overcast, enough to see the road as a slightly lighter ribbon through the dark timber. The temperature had dropped sharply with the sunset, the kind of cold that came off the high peaks and settled in the valleys like a liquid, pooling in the low spots, shockingly frigid where the road dipped into hollows. Ellie was asleep. She'd fought it for a long time. He'd felt her resisting, the slight rigidity of determination, the slow losing battle. And then she'd gone under between one breath and the next, the way children do, instantly and completely, her head falling back against his chest. He'd adjusted his arm around her and kept riding. The road to Telford ran along the east side of the Mara tributary, mostly flat, with the river to the left and the mountain slope to the right. It was good road by territorial standards. The federal mail ran it, which meant it was cleared and graded with something approaching regularity. In daylight, it was a pleasant ride. In this dark, at this pace, with the river talking to itself in the blackness below the cut bank and the wind moving through the timber in long, oceanic waves, it was something else. He smelled it before he heard it. Wet pine again, but different from the passive, ambient smell of the forest around him. This was fresher, cut, recent, a tree across the road. He pulled Duchess up in time. She'd already seen it. She stopped with her nose 6 inches from the bark blowing. Not fallen. Cut. He could see the pale slash of the cut end, the fresh wood gleaming faintly. A lodgepole pine, maybe 14 inches across, taken down recently enough that the resin was still running. He sat still in the saddle and listened. The river, the wind, the settling of the forest. Then, from behind, the sound of hooves on the road. Not close. A quarter mile, maybe. But coming. He turned Duchess off the road. There was a gap in the timber, a game trail. He'd seen it just before the fallen tree, and pushed her into the darkness between the pines. The trail was narrow, and he had to lean forward over Ellie to avoid a branch, the rough bark catching his hat and nearly taking it. Duchess moved carefully, each hoof finding purchase on the root-threaded forest floor. 20 feet in, he stopped. The hooves on the road grew louder. 3 horses, maybe 4, moving fast. He heard them slow at the fallen tree. A voice, low. A command he couldn't make out. Then a sound that was definitely not what he wanted to hear. A dog. Deep-voiced, purposeful. A tracking dog. Of course, he thought. Of course Hale had a dog. He looked at Ellie, still asleep against his chest. He looked at the forest around him, which was absolute blackness, more than 10 feet in any direction. A maze of timber and undergrowth, and the treacherous footing of roots and stones and creek-cut channels. He had 3 options. Ride hard on the game trail and hope it went somewhere useful, which it might not. Stay still and hope the dog lost the scent in the cold air, which it wouldn't. Or the river. He could hear it below the cut bank, closer here, the trail having angled toward the water. If he got Duchess into the river, even for 100 yards upstream, the scent would break. He nudged Duchess toward the sound of the water. She found the bank edge before he did. She stopped and tested it with a forefoot, and it was steep, very steep, a 3-foot drop to the gravel bar below. He swung down carefully, keeping Ellie cradled against him with one arm, and dropped to the gravel with a crunch that seemed enormous in the night. Ellie woke. She looked up at him, dark eyes wide, immediately alert. No grogginess, no confusion. She had the waking pattern of someone who had learned that disorientation was dangerous. He put his finger to his lips. She nodded. He led Duchess into the water. The Mara tributary in October was snowmelt cold, the kind of cold that wasn't a temperature so much as an argument about whether your feet belonged to you anymore. It came up to Duchess's knees, then her belly, then, at the deepest channel, to her belly with a foot to spare, the current pushing against her legs with steady, unreasonable insistence. The sound of it swallowed all other sounds. The gravel of the riverbed, visible in the faint light as a pale shimmer, shifted and rolled under each step. Ellie had pulled her feet up instinctively, keeping them above the water. She held onto the saddle horn with both hands and said nothing. 100 yards upstream, the bank lowered on the far side, and a gravel bar extended from it. Cade pushed across and led Duchess up, and they came out on the far bank with the sound of the river behind them and the forest ahead. Different trees on this side, older, more open, hemlock and spruce rather than lodgepole, the canopy higher. He stopped, listened. The dog, On the other side of the river now, on the other side of their crossing. He heard it hit the bank and stop, heard it casting back and forth, the confused, frustrated sound of a trail that has ended at water. Heard one of the riders curse. Then silence, and the river, and the cold. He stood for a long time, hand on Duchess's neck, letting his heart do whatever it needed to do. Ellie slid down from the saddle and stood beside him, her shoulder against his leg, the key held in her fist. He looked down at her. "We're going to be all right," he said. He wasn't sure if it was true, but it was the thing to say. She looked up at him, and in the faint ambient light her expression was something he couldn't quite name. Not fear, not confidence. Something between them. Something that had decided, despite all available evidence, to continue. He lifted her back into the saddle. He mounted behind her. They rode north, through the dark, through the hemlock silence, with the river behind them and Telford ahead, and for a long time neither of them moved except with the rhythm of Duchess's walking and the slow, steady breathing of two people who have decided, without discussing it, to get to the other side. Part 9. Morning and the Last Miles. Dawn came the way it does in the mountains in October, not gradually, but in stages, each one a negotiation. First the black became gray. Then the gray separated into sky and tree line. Then the shapes within the tree line became individual trees, and the road became a road again instead of a dark guess, and color returned reluctantly, in the order it always returned. The pale buff of the road first, then the dark green of the pines, then the silver of the river visible through the trees, then the orange and rose of the peaks above catching the sun before it reached the valley floor. They were 9 miles from Telford. He'd been reckoning it by landmarks he remembered. A creek crossing with a distinctive split rock, a section of road that ran beneath a limestone overhang, a junction where the Telford Road met the old mining track to the Beaumont diggings. 9 miles. 3 hours at a walk, less if he pushed. He didn't push. Duchess had given everything she had last night, and deserved to be treated like the actual good animal she was. And Ellie, who had been asleep again for 2 hours before dawn, and was now awake and sitting straight in the saddle, was eating the last of the hard cheese, and watching the road with the businesslike attention of someone who has decided to get through this day. They talked, for the first time, in the morning. Not dramatically. Not in the way that the moment perhaps deserved. It started because Cade made the mistake of yawning, a vast, jaw-cracking yawn that he couldn't suppress, and Ellie glanced back at him with an expression that was unmistakably amused, and he said, "Yeah, it's been a long night." And she made a sound, a small sound, not a word, but intentional. He looked at her. She made it again, and he realized she was trying to say yes. The consonants weren't there, or weren't reliable, but the shape of the word was present, and the intention behind it was vivid. "Do you?" he started, then thought about how to ask it. "Has talking always been?" She shook her head. Then she touched her throat, and then made a brief downward gesture that he thought meant after something. He nodded and didn't ask further. After a while she pointed at him and made a questioning gesture, both hands open. "A what about you motion?" "What about me?" he said. She made a gesture at the road, at Duchess, at him generally. "This. Why this? Why am I a bounty hunter?" She nodded. He thought about it. "Money," he said. Simple answer. True answer. She looked at him with skepticism, so polite it was almost complimentary. "What?" he said. She made the gesture again. "There's a longer answer," he said. "I was a deputy for a while, in a county south of here. I had a—" He stopped. "I had people. And something happened. And afterward I wasn't good for much that required staying in one place. So I moved. And bounty hunting is good for people who move." She thought about this. Then she made a new gesture. Both hands, palms up. A then what motion? "Like it now." "Now," he said. "I'm riding to Telford with a box that's going to cause a considerable amount of chaos. And a girl who—" He stopped again. She was looking at him over her shoulder. "Who is going to be all right," he said. "Whatever happens. I'm going to make sure of that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the road and put one small hand on top of the forearm he had around her, briefly, the way you touch a railing to steady yourself. He felt it, that small weight and warmth, in a place he'd thought had been closed off for years. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. They rode. Part 10, Telford. Judge Harlan Carmichael was a large man with small glasses and a reputation for impartiality that, in the Ashbone Territory, made him either the most respected or the most endangered man in any given room, depending on who you asked and what they'd done. His office was on the second floor of the Territorial Court building, a stone building, the only stone building in Telford, which the judge had insisted upon because he'd said he intended to last and wood buildings didn't. Cade had never met him. He'd appeared before him once, years ago, delivering a fugitive. Carmichael had looked at the paperwork, looked at the fugitive, looked at Cade, and said nothing except the clerk will handle the payment, in a voice that contained, somehow, an entire editorial on the business of bounty hunting. They reached Telford at 9:30 in the morning. The town was awake and ordinary. A freight wagon heading out, a woman beating a rug on a porch railing, two men arguing about the price of lumber outside the sawmill. The court building sat at the end of the main street, like a period at the end of a sentence. Cade helped Ellie down from Duchess. She stood straight, the key around her neck, her oversized boots planted in the mud of Telford's main street, and looked at the court building. "Ready?" he said. She squared her shoulders. She was, he thought, the toughest person he'd met in recent memory, and that included himself. They went up the steps. The next 4 hours were not simple. Nothing involving a territorial judge, a box full of documents implicating the territorial government, and a 9-year-old mute girl is simple, as a general rule. There were other clerks, and a court officer, who initially refused them entry until Cade said 3 words, Denton Hale's ledger, and the color left the man's face, and he showed them up the stairs immediately. There was a 2-hour session with Carmichael himself, who read every document twice and asked questions in the methodical, unhurried manner of a man who understands that the quality of his attention is the only tool he has. There was a writ issued and a messenger dispatched to the Federal Circuit, and 2 deputies sent south toward the Ashbone Pass with orders that were written in the terse language of men who understand that time is the relevant variable. Cade stood by the window during most of this and watched the street below. No riders from the south. Not yet. They would come. The lean man and the broad man, if Hale accepted their story, or someone else if he didn't. Hale himself, possibly, though men like Hale generally preferred distance from their violence. It would come, and it would be dealt with, because that was how these things worked. Carmichael's messenger, now on a fast horse heading east, changed the equation. Once the Federal Circuit knew, once the documentation was in a judge's hands, and the judge was still alive and shouting about it, the calculation shifted for everyone involved. It wasn't over, but it was different. Ellie sat in the chair beside the judge's desk through all of it, watching each person who spoke with the same unflinching attention she brought to everything. When Carmichael asked her direct questions, she answered them in her limited way. Gestures, nods, the occasional attempted word, and Carmichael, who had been at the bar for 40 years and had developed the ability to understand what people meant regardless of what they said, seemed to have no difficulty with her. At one point, during a pause in the proceedings, the judge looked at Cade and said, "This child came through the Ashbone Pass last night." "Yes," Cade said. Carmichael looked at Ellie. "Remarkable," he said simply. Ellie, who had been watching this exchange, looked at Cade with an expression that might have been the beginning of a smile. The very architecture of a smile, the suggestion of it, like seeing the framing of a house before the walls go up. Part 11, what stays? By afternoon, Cade had handed the box to the court officer, given his statement to a clerk, and collected nothing except an acknowledgment written on official paper, which was fine. He hadn't done any of this for money, which was new, and he was doing his best not to examine it too closely because he suspected the examination would be unsettling. He found Ellie in the court building's anteroom, sitting with a cup of something hot that one of the clerks had brought her, looking out the window at Telford's main street. She'd been given a blanket that was wrapped around her shoulders, and she looked, for the first time since he'd found her standing in the road, approximately like a child in a safe place. Approximately. He sat down across from her. "Carmichael's going to arrange something," he said. "For you." "He has. I think he said a sister in Millhaven, on the eastern side. She takes in children sometimes." He paused. "It's a good town. Settled. School." She looked at him. "I looked into it," he said, which was not true. He'd asked the court clerk, which was close enough. "It's a good situation." She continued looking at him. He looked back at her, and then at the floor, and then at the window, and then, without having intended to, at the photograph he kept in his breast pocket, the one he never looked at. He had it out before he realized he'd reached for it. He sat with it in his hands for a moment. Then he put it on the table between them. A woman and a girl. The girl maybe 6 in the picture, which made the photograph 8 years old. The woman was laughing at something outside the frame. The girl was looking directly at the camera with dark, serious eyes that were. He became aware that Ellie was looking at the photograph, and then at him, and then at the photograph again, with the particular attention of someone putting together a puzzle. "My daughter," he said, "and her mother." He picked the photograph up. "They live in Calhoun County, with her mother's family. It's complicated." He put the photograph away. "The thing I told you," he said, "about something happening, about me not being good for staying in one place afterward." He looked out the window. "I was good for them less than they deserved. So I left, which I thought was better, but—" He stopped. Ellie was watching him with the expression that she wore when she was waiting for the rest of what someone was saying. "I think about going back," he said. "Sometimes." She made a gesture. "Then go." He almost laughed. He caught it at the last moment, and it came out as something else. Not quite a laugh. Not quite, not one. "It's not that simple," he said. She gave him a look of such composed, explicit skepticism that he understood, in a way he hadn't in 8 years, that it was, in fact, that simple. That the complicated machinery he'd built around his own inaction was exactly what he'd built it to be. Machinery for staying still while feeling like he was in motion. He sat with that for a moment. "You're 9 years old," he said. She held up 10 fingers, then folded one back. "9. 9, he said. "And you just rode through the Ashbone Pass in the dark to bring evidence to a federal judge that could bring down the territorial government." She looked at the table. "I'm just saying," he said. "You don't lack for nerve." She looked up, and this time the smile came all the way, small, careful, a little lopsided, like something that had been a long time unused and needed to warm up, but real, completely, undeniably real. He felt it somewhere in his chest like a key turning. Epilogue. After the rain, he stayed in Telford 4 days. He told himself it was practical, waiting to see if Hale's men came north, which 2 of them did, on the 3rd day, and were met at the edge of town by Carmichael's deputies and federal authority, and the particular cold efficiency of men who understood that the ground had shifted. Hale himself, as Cade had predicted, maintained distance, and then, when the federal circuit rider arrived on the 4th day with a warrant that had no room for negotiation, something less than distance, something closer to flight, which didn't avail him much. These things rarely do. When the paperwork is already in a judge's hands, and the judge is made of stone. The arrangement for Ellie materialized. Carmichael's sister was real, and the town of Millhaven was real, and the woman herself, a solid, clear-eyed person named Ruth, who communicated warmth the way a stove communicates heat, without announcing it, arrived on the 3rd day to assess the situation and declared it, in the direct manner of someone who had seen worse situations manageable. Ellie met her in the court building's anteroom. They sat across from each other, and Ruth asked careful questions, and Ellie answered them in her way. And after about 20 minutes, Ruth looked up at Cade and said, "She's welcome in my home as long as she needs it." On the morning of the 5th day, Cade saddled Duchess. Ellie was there. She had the wooden horse from her pocket, the carved one, thumb-sized, and she held it out to him. He started to refuse, and she gave him the look that he'd learned, over the past 4 days, meant don't be an idiot about this. And he took it. He turned it over in his fingers. "Good carving. Her father's work, probably." "I'll give it back," he said. She shook her head. "Not no, but that's not the point." He put it in his breast pocket, next to the photograph. He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning was cold and clear, the sky the deep blue of October at altitude, the Ashbone peaks visible to the south, still carrying last week's snow. The smell of Telford in the morning was coffee smoke and horse and fresh-cut lumber, and underneath it, faint, the ghost of wet pine from the mountains. He thought about what he'd said, about Calhoun County, about going back, about simple things that he'd made complicated. Ruth seems like good people, he said. Ellie nodded. You'll do well, he said. He stopped. Started again. I'm certain of it. She looked at him with dark, steady eyes, and she made one gesture, the same gesture she'd made on the road, the questioning one, both palms open. Then what? He understood her differently now. She wasn't asking him to justify himself. She was asking where he was going. South, he said. Calhoun County is south. Something moved across her face. That small internal earthquake, less suppressed this time. He mounted Duchess. He looked down at her from the saddle. This small girl who'd been standing in a road in the rain 4 days ago with nothing but a key and a crushed letter and more nerve than most men he'd known, who'd ridden through a pass in a storm and through a river in the dark and into a judge's office without flinching, carrying something that could break a government, and had done it, had set it in motion, a 9-year-old girl who hadn't been able to save her father, but had done every single thing he'd asked her to do. To the end. Hey, he said. She looked up. My daughter's name is Clara, he said. I'll tell her about you. If that's... He stopped. I'll tell her. Ellie nodded once. Serious. As if this were a formal agreement. He turned Duchess south. He didn't look back. He was, by temperament and practice, a man who didn't look back, who had made a habit of forward motion partly from necessity and partly from a long, low fear that looking back would stop him moving altogether. But at the edge of Telford, where the main street ended and the south road began and the mountains rose behind him in the clear October morning, he stopped. He turned. She was still there, standing on the steps of the court building, the blanket around her shoulders, the key still at her throat. Carmichael had asked for it as evidence, and she'd looked at him with such still refusal that he'd said, never mind, keep it. She was small against the stone building, small and very straight, and she raised one hand. He raised one hand back. Then he rode south. The territorial Marshal Denton Hale was arrested 6 weeks later and tried before the Federal Circuit Court in the spring. He was convicted on 14 counts. The territorial governor resigned before the trial concluded. The land grants were voided, the parcels returned to public record, the families of T.A. Mason and the other 2 surveyors compensated by act of the territorial legislature. Eleanor Mason Ellie lived with Ruth Carmichael in Millhaven until she was 17, at which point she enrolled in the first class of women accepted to the territorial normal school and became a teacher. She learned to speak again gradually, over years, the way a river finds its channel after a flood. Not the same river, but a river. She kept the key. Cade Marlowe reached Calhoun County in late November, when the first serious snow was coming off the mountains. He stood on a porch he'd built himself, years ago, and knocked on a door he'd walked out of, and waited. What happened next is not this story's to tell, but the small carved wooden horse sat on a windowsill in Millhaven for years, in the room of a girl who had ridden through a storm and come out the other side. And on clear days the sun came through that window in the afternoon and caught it just right, and it looked, in that light, as if it were running.